A waitress reached for the bill, but the billionaire woman suddenly stood up and whispered, "If he remembers me, everything I have built will disappear." Every conversation inside the luxury restaurant stopped. Dozens of eyes turned toward the exhausted single father sitting with his little daughter near the window. The father frowned, convinced the elegant stranger had mistaken his table for someone else's. He smiled politely and slid the leather bill folder toward her. "Ma'am, I think you have the wrong table." The woman did not move. Instead, tears quietly gathered in her eyes. Then she asked a question that made everyone freeze. "Ethan, after all these years, do you still hate me?" The little girl looked up at her father in confusion. Ethan's face slowly lost its color. Nobody inside the restaurant understood why the richest woman in the city suddenly sounded terrified. And nobody was prepared for what happened next. Only a few hours earlier, Ethan Brooks had been finishing another 10-hour shift repairing heating systems across Chicago. His work boots were dusty. His hands carried years of honest labor. He drove an old white pickup truck with more than 200,000 miles on it. Every dollar he earned had a purpose: mortgage, groceries, school supplies, medicine. His 10-year-old daughter Lily knew they could never afford expensive vacations, but she never complained. She believed her father could fix almost anything except one thing: the sadness he tried so hard to hide. But today felt different. Ethan had promised her one special birthday dinner. Just one evening where she could feel like every other little girl. He had absolutely no idea that promise would reopen a chapter of his life he had buried for more than 12 years. "Dad, are you sure this place is not too expensive?" Lily whispered as they stood outside one of Chicago's most elegant restaurants. Crystal lights glowed behind enormous glass windows. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Men in tailored suits laughed while photographers snapped pictures of celebrities arriving for a charity gala upstairs. Ethan checked the folded coupon hidden inside his wallet for the 5th time. It was a birthday promotion he had won months ago through a local radio contest. One free dinner for two before 6 o'clock. It was the only reason he dared walk through those doors. He smiled at Lily. "Tonight is your birthday. You deserve one beautiful memory." Neither of them noticed someone watching from the second-floor balcony. Inside, the hostess welcomed them with a professional smile that faded the moment she noticed Ethan's worn jacket. She glanced at the reservation list twice before finding the coupon confirmation. A nearby couple exchanged amused looks. One man quietly muttered, "Guess they let anyone in these days." Ethan heard every word but pretended not to. Lily squeezed his hand a little tighter. She had seen that expression before. It was the same look strangers gave her father almost everywhere they went. Judgment before conversation. Assumptions before kindness. But Ethan simply thanked the hostess and followed her toward a quiet corner table. He believed the night could still be saved. He was wrong. As Ethan pulled out Lily's chair, another waiter hurried across the dining room, carrying a tray of sparkling drinks. A guest suddenly stepped backward without looking. The waiter stumbled. Several champagne glasses crashed onto the marble floor beside Ethan's table. The loud sound silenced the room. Before anyone could explain what happened, an angry businessman pointed directly at Ethan. "Watch where you're going." Ethan looked down in confusion. He had not moved an inch. Yet whispers immediately spread through the restaurant. Some people assumed the poorly dressed man must have caused the accident. The waiter opened his mouth to explain the truth, but his manager arrived first. "I am terribly sorry, ladies and gentlemen," the manager announced loudly. Then he turned toward Ethan. "Sir, perhaps tonight is not the right evening for your family." Ethan blinked in disbelief. "Excuse me." The manager lowered his voice just enough to sound polite. "Our guests are here for a peaceful dining experience." Lily looked around at the curious faces staring directly at them. Her birthday smile slowly disappeared. Ethan could have argued. Instead, he calmly replied, "My daughter did nothing wrong." But the manager had already decided who belonged in the room and who did not. What happened next shocked even some of the restaurant staff. An elderly waitress named Martha suddenly stepped forward. "He never touched the waiter," she said firmly. "I saw the entire thing." The manager frowned. "Martha, please return to your station." She did not move. Years of working in that restaurant had taught her something more valuable than luxury: character. She looked directly at Ethan and quietly apologized. "Please don't leave." Several customers began whispering again. Why would the oldest employee risk her job defending a stranger she had never met? Even Ethan could not understand her determination. But someone upstairs was listening to every word. On the private balcony overlooking the dining room, Victoria Sinclair slowly lowered the business contract she had been reading. At 42 years old, she was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in America. Her investment company owned hotels, technology firms, restaurants, and real estate across the country. Newspapers described her as fearless. Television interviews praised her intelligence. Financial magazines called her untouchable. Yet the moment her eyes landed on the single father downstairs, every ounce of confidence disappeared. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered across the polished floor. Her assistant rushed toward her. "Miss Sinclair, are you all right?" Victoria never answered. She kept staring at Ethan as though she had just seen a ghost. "Cancel the meeting," she whispered. "The investors have flown in from New York." "I said cancel it." Her assistant had worked beside Victoria for 8 years. Never once had she seen her employer abandon a meeting worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet Victoria ignored every protest. She slowly walked toward the staircase without taking her eyes off the man below. One security guard asked whether she needed assistance. She simply replied, "No, I need answers." Nobody understood why America's most powerful businesswoman suddenly looked terrified. Downstairs, Ethan finally convinced Lily to open the birthday menu. She forced a smile. "Can I really order anything?" Ethan laughed softly. "Within reason." Lily pointed at a slice of chocolate cake topped with fresh strawberries. Ethan secretly checked the remaining cash inside his wallet again. Even with the coupon, dessert might stretch the budget. He quietly decided to skip his own meal if necessary. Lily noticed him counting the bills and pretended she was no longer hungry. Neither father nor daughter wanted the other to sacrifice. Neither realized someone nearby had already noticed everything. Martha returned carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "These are on the house," she whispered. Ethan politely refused. "We cannot accept free things." Martha smiled sadly. "Kindness is not charity." Before Ethan could answer, applause suddenly echoed from the staircase. Every head turned. Victoria Sinclair had entered the dining room. Conversations immediately stopped. Guests stood to greet the billionaire. Some reached for their phones. Others hoped for a photograph. But Victoria ignored everyone. She walked past politicians, past celebrities, past wealthy investors. She headed directly toward Ethan's table. The entire restaurant watched in complete silence. Ethan stood respectfully as she approached. He assumed she wanted the empty table beside them. Instead, Victoria stopped only inches away. Her hands trembled. She stared at Lily before looking back at Ethan. For several long seconds, she could not speak. Finally, she pulled out the chair across from him and quietly asked, "May I sit here?" Ethan glanced around the crowded restaurant. "Ma'am, I think you may have mistaken us for someone else." Victoria slowly shook her head. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "No," she whispered. "I have been trying to find you for 12 years." Every guest leaned forward, desperate to hear more. Ethan's heart began pounding. Because deep inside, one forgotten memory had just started coming back. But he still had no idea why the richest woman in the room looked more frightened than he did. Victoria's words echoed through the silent dining room. "I have been trying to find you for 12 years." Ethan searched her face, but nothing made sense. She looked familiar, yet impossibly distant, like someone from a dream he had forgotten. Lily glanced between them with wide eyes. "Dad, do you know her?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "I do not think so." Victoria closed her eyes for a brief second, almost as if that answer hurt more than she expected. Around them, dozens of curious guests leaned closer, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. But nobody realized the biggest misunderstanding had only just begun. Victoria carefully placed a small leather envelope on the table. She did not open it. She simply rested one trembling hand on top of it. "Before you tell me to leave," she said softly, "there is something you deserve to know." Ethan looked at the envelope without touching it. Years of struggling had taught him to be cautious whenever wealthy strangers suddenly became generous. Nothing good ever came without a reason. He answered politely, "Ma'am, if this is about money, we are fine." Victoria almost smiled. This has never been about money. That answer only created more questions. Across the restaurant, whispers spread like wildfire. "Why is Victoria Sinclair sitting with that man?" one guest asked. "Is he a famous investor?" another guessed. A social media influencer quietly began recording from the next table. Even the restaurant manager forgot about the earlier argument and stared in disbelief. Every employee in the building knew Victoria personally. She owned the restaurant. She rarely entered the dining room. Yet tonight she had abandoned a meeting worth hundreds of millions of dollars just to speak with a man wearing dusty work boots. Nobody could understand why. Lily finally broke the silence. "Miss, are you one of Dad's old friends?" Victoria looked at the little girl for several seconds before answering. "I wish I could say yes." Her voice cracked with emotion. "Your father once changed my life." Ethan frowned immediately. "I think you have mistaken me for someone else." Victoria slowly shook her head again. "No, Ethan. I remember your face far too well." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. She knew his name. He had never introduced himself. Neither had Lily. So how could she possibly know? The answer took Ethan back 12 years. At that time, Ethan had not been repairing furnaces or fixing broken air conditioners. He had been a volunteer firefighter in a small Illinois town. The pay was modest, but he loved serving his community. Every shift brought uncertainty. Every emergency reminded him how fragile life could be. His wife, Sarah, often worried about him. She would kiss him before every overnight shift and jokingly demand he come home with every bone still intact. Ethan always laughed. He never imagined those simple moments would become his most treasured memories. One rainy autumn evening, dispatch reported a serious highway accident involving several vehicles. Ethan's rescue team arrived within minutes. Most victims had already been evacuated. One luxury SUV, however, had rolled into a deep ditch beneath a collapsed guardrail. Smoke poured from the damaged engine. Ethan climbed inside without hesitation. Behind the steering wheel sat a young woman covered in blood, barely conscious. She repeatedly whispered the same sentence. "Please, save the baby." Ethan searched the back seat. There was no child, only a small pink blanket. He carried the woman out seconds before flames consumed the vehicle. The rescue made local news for less than 24 hours before everyone moved on. Ethan never learned her name. Back in the restaurant, Ethan stared at Victoria. "The accident," he whispered almost to himself. Victoria nodded slowly. Tears filled her eyes again. "I was 29. Ethan remembered more pieces. "You kept asking about a baby." Victoria looked down at the table. "Because I had just lost one." Silence settled between them. Even the clinking of silverware throughout the restaurant seemed to disappear. Lily reached over and gently held her father's hand. She could feel his fingers trembling. "I never thanked you," Victoria continued quietly. "When I woke up in the hospital, they told me the firefighter who saved me had already returned to duty." Ethan looked uncomfortable. "That was my job." Victoria smiled sadly. "No, it was much more than that." She slowly opened the leather envelope. Inside lay a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local firefighter saves young woman from burning SUV." The photograph was grainy, but Ethan immediately recognized himself carrying someone through heavy smoke. Across the table, Lily stared at the old picture in amazement. "Dad, that is really you." Ethan lowered his eyes. He had almost forgotten the rescue. Life had changed so much afterward. Only 6 months later, Sarah was diagnosed with an aggressive illness. Medical bills consumed everything they had saved. Ethan resigned from the fire department to care for her full-time. When Sarah passed away 2 years later, he buried not only the love of his life, but also every dream they had shared. Since then, survival had become his only priority. Working multiple repair jobs left little room for memories. The man who had once rushed into burning buildings now spent his days quietly repairing broken furnaces so his daughter would never sleep in a cold house. He had never expected anyone to remember who he used to be. Victoria looked directly into his eyes. "I hired private investigators for years." Ethan blinked in surprise. "Why?" She hesitated before answering. "Because after the accident, I built my entire life on one promise." Ethan remained silent. "I promised that if I ever became successful enough, I would repay the man who gave me a second chance." Around them, several restaurant guests exchanged emotional glances. The story sounded almost unbelievable. But one person in the room did not look touched at all. Standing near the entrance, the restaurant manager folded his arms impatiently. He had already recognized the danger. If Victoria publicly admitted that his staff had humiliated the very man who had once saved her life, his career would be over. Quietly, he signaled one of the assistant managers. Find out everything about that man, he whispered. Immediately, neither of them noticed Martha watching from across the room. She understood exactly what they were trying to do, and she had no intention of letting history be rewritten. Victoria gently slid the newspaper clipping toward Ethan. You probably think this dinner happened by coincidence. Ethan nodded honestly. Did it not? Victoria slowly reached into her purse once more. This time she removed a neatly folded birthday coupon identical to the one Ethan had used earlier. She placed it beside the clipping. Ethan frowned in confusion. Why do you have that? Victoria took a deep breath before revealing the truth. Because I created it. Ethan stared at her, unable to speak. She continued, for the last 3 years, every birthday promotion in every restaurant my company owns has secretly served one purpose. Lily leaned forward. What purpose? Victoria looked directly at Ethan before answering the question that stunned the entire dining room. To help me find the man who disappeared after saving my life. But even Victoria had no idea that the biggest truth about Ethan had still not been revealed. The restaurant had never been this quiet. Even the musicians in the corner stopped playing. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on Ethan and Victoria. The billionaire had just admitted that she had spent 3 years searching for the man who once saved her life. Yet the expression on Ethan's face held no excitement, only confusion. He could not understand why someone with unlimited wealth would build an entire campaign around finding an ordinary single father. But Victoria's next words made the mystery even deeper. It was never about repaying a debt, she said softly. Ethan looked directly into her eyes. Then what was it about? Victoria hesitated for several seconds before answering. It was about keeping a promise. That answer only raised another question. Lily quietly leaned closer to her father. Dad, what promise? Victoria lowered her eyes. A promise I made to someone who never got the chance to meet you. The room fell silent once again. Before Ethan could respond, the restaurant manager finally stepped forward wearing a carefully rehearsed smile. Ms. Sinclair, he interrupted politely. Perhaps this conversation would be more comfortable in the private dining suite. Victoria slowly turned toward him. No. The single word sounded calm, but it carried enough authority to freeze everyone nearby. I am perfectly comfortable right here. The manager forced another smile. I only thought. You thought wrong. His smile disappeared instantly. Everyone watching realized something unusual. Victoria was not protecting her own reputation. She was protecting Ethan's. And nobody understood why. Meanwhile, Martha quietly returned carrying Lily's birthday cake. A single candle flickered in the center. She gently placed it in front of Lily. Happy birthday, sweetheart. Lily smiled for the first time all evening. Thank you. Before she could blow out the candle, Victoria reached into her purse again. This time she removed a small velvet box. She slid it toward Lily. I brought this for you. Ethan immediately pushed it back. I'm sorry, but we cannot accept expensive gifts. Victoria did not argue. I understand. She calmly opened the box herself. Inside was not jewelry, not money, not diamonds. It was a tiny silver firefighter badge. Old, scratched, clearly worn by time. Ethan's breathing suddenly stopped. He recognized it immediately. He had lost that badge 12 years earlier at the accident scene. He had searched for it for weeks. Where did you get this? He whispered. Victoria carefully held the badge in her palm. It was found inside the burned vehicle after the fire was extinguished. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. I thought it had melted. It almost did. She smiled faintly. I kept it because it reminded me that a stranger valued my life more than his own safety. Lily looked proudly at her father. You were really a firefighter. Ethan nodded slowly. A long time ago. Victoria looked at Lily with gentle eyes. He was one of the bravest men I have ever known. Ethan quickly shook his head. I was simply doing my job. No, Victoria replied. My doctors told me every other rescuer believed the vehicle would explode. She paused. You were the only one who went back inside. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. The story sounded impossible. Yet nobody doubted Victoria. She had no reason to invent it. Across the dining room, the manager quietly motioned another employee toward the office. Bring me every employment record, he whispered, and erased the security footage from earlier. Unfortunately for him, someone else overheard every word. Martha. She immediately walked into the kitchen, removed her phone from her apron, and pressed record. She had worked in the restaurant for 26 years. She had seen managers protect wealthy guests before. But tonight felt different. Tonight she intended to protect the truth. Back at the table, Victoria finally took a deep breath. There is something I have never told another living person. Ethan remained silent. The night of the accident, I was not driving home from work. She stopped. Her fingers tightened around the old firefighter badge. I was driving away from my family forever. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? My father had just disowned me. The words surprised everyone nearby. Victoria Sinclair, the billionaire admired across America, had once been rejected by her own family. My father believed I was incapable of leading the family business, she continued. He told me I would lose everything within a year. She smiled bitterly. He was almost right. Ethan listened quietly. I had already signed documents giving up my inheritance. Several guests gasped softly. I owned almost nothing after that accident. She looked around the luxurious restaurant. Everything people see today came later. Lily blinked in surprise. You were poor too? Victoria nodded. Poor enough to sleep in my car. The little girl looked at Ethan. Dad, she sounds like us. Victoria laughed gently through her tears. More than you realize. Ethan finally understood something. The woman sitting across from him was not trying to impress him with her success. She was remembering the person she had once been. But one question still refused to leave his mind. If you spent years searching for me. He looked around the restaurant. Why now? Victoria's expression changed. For the first time that evening, genuine fear appeared on her face. Because someone else found you first. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. What are you talking about? Instead of answering, Victoria slowly turned toward the entrance. A tall man in an expensive navy suit had just walked inside. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His expression remained cold. The moment Victoria saw him, all the color drained from her face. No, she whispered. He came. The man ignored every guest. He walked directly toward their table with the confidence of someone who expected complete obedience. Several employees immediately lowered their heads in respect. Even the restaurant manager straightened his posture. Lily quietly whispered, Dad, who is that? Victoria never looked away from the approaching man. My father. Ethan immediately noticed something unusual. The older man was not looking at Victoria. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan, as though he had been searching for him as well. He stopped beside the table without greeting anyone. Then, in a calm voice that somehow felt colder than anger, he spoke words that instantly shattered every assumption Ethan had made about the evening. So, the old billionaire said, after 12 years, we finally meet. Ethan slowly stood. I am sorry, sir. The older man interrupted him. You saved my daughter. He paused. And because of that, his expression hardened. You destroyed my family. Nobody at the table could understand how saving a stranger's life could possibly ruin an entire billionaire family. But the answer was about to change Ethan's life forever. The accusation struck the dining room harder than any shout could have. You destroyed my family. No one spoke. Even the musicians stood frozen. Ethan stared at the older man, completely unable to understand. I saved your daughter's life. You did. Then how could that destroy your family? The billionaire slowly pulled out a chair, but remained standing beside it. Because she survived. Confusion spread across every face in the room. Victoria closed her eyes. Father. He raised one hand, stopping her. No. He deserves to know. The old man looked directly at Ethan. My name is Richard Sinclair. I know who you are. You know my name. You do not know my story. Richard's voice remained calm. 12 years ago, Sinclair Holdings was not the empire people see today. Our company was drowning. We owed banks hundreds of millions. Our board wanted stability. Our investors wanted certainty. And I wanted one thing. He looked toward Victoria. A successor who would obey. Victoria lowered her head. I refused. Richard nodded. She wanted to leave the company. She wanted to become a teacher. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. America's most feared billionaire had once dreamed of teaching children. Richard continued. The night of the accident, she had already signed documents surrendering every share she owned. If she disappeared, he stopped. Those shares would have returned to the family trust. The room suddenly grew even quieter. My lawyers had already prepared every document. Ethan slowly realized what Richard was implying. If she had died, the company would have remained under my complete control. Victoria finally whispered, Please stop. But Richard ignored her. Instead, he pointed toward Ethan. You carried her out of that burning vehicle. He let the words hang in the air. She survived. She recovered. And 6 months later, Richard smiled bitterly. She came back. Victoria looked straight at Ethan. I challenged my father. I bought out every executive who betrayed the company. I rebuilt everything from scratch. Richard finished her sentence. And she forced me into retirement. No one knew what to say. For the first time that evening, Ethan understood the true reason Richard believed his family had been destroyed. Not because Ethan had harmed them. Because one act of courage had changed the future. Richard slowly sat down. I spent years hating a man whose name I never knew. Victoria quietly wiped away another tear. I spent years trying to thank him. Father and daughter sat only a few feet apart. Yet they sounded like strangers. Lily gently tugged Ethan's sleeve. Dad, yes. Is he still angry because you saved someone? Ethan looked at Richard. I think he is. Richard surprised everyone by answering himself. No. He looked down at his hands. I was angry because I lost control. The honesty caught the entire restaurant off guard. Victoria stared at her father. I have waited 12 years to hear you admit that. Richard laughed softly. It took 12 years. It also took meeting the man I blame. Silence settled again. Then Richard reached into the inside pocket of his suit. Everyone instinctively became tense. The security guards subtly stepped closer. Richard ignored them. Instead of a weapon, he removed a folded piece of paper. Its edges had yellowed with age. He slid it across the table toward Ethan. I believe this belongs to you. Ethan carefully unfolded it. His eyes widened immediately. It was an old handwritten recommendation letter, signed by the chief of the volunteer fire department. The final paragraph read, Firefighter Ethan Brooks displayed extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. I strongly recommend him for promotion to battalion captain. The letter had never reached him. Ethan stared at the date. It had been written 2 days after the rescue. I never received this. I know. Richard nodded. I made sure you didn't. Victoria looked at her father in disbelief. What? Richard slowly exhaled. My company controlled the insurance investigation. The accident became a legal nightmare. My attorneys believed promoting the firefighter involved would attract unnecessary attention. So, he paused. I ordered every recommendation connected to the incident to disappear. The room erupted into shocked whispers. Ethan remained perfectly still. Not angry, not shouting, simply stunned. You buried my career. Richard nodded once. Yes. Victoria stood abruptly. You told me the department had changed its decision. I lied. You let him lose everything. I did. You knew nothing about his family. I did not. You never cared. Richard did not answer. Because he couldn't. For the first time in decades, the billionaire had no defense. Lily looked at Ethan with tears forming in her eyes. Dad, you could have been a captain? Ethan smiled gently. Maybe. Does that make you sad? He looked at the faded letter for several seconds. Then he carefully folded it again. It used to. Everyone expected him to explode with anger. Instead, he looked toward Lily. But if that promotion had happened, I probably would have been working somewhere else. I might never have spent so much time with your mother. I might not have been there during her illness. I might have missed thousands of ordinary moments. He smiled at his daughter. I cannot regret the road that brought me to you. Lily threw her arms around him. I love you, Dad. I love you too. Many guests quietly wiped away tears. Even Martha turned away for a moment. Victoria watched the embrace with admiration. She had spent 12 years believing Ethan was the hero because he had saved her life. Now she realized. His greatest act of courage had nothing to do with a burning vehicle. It was the quiet strength with which he had lived every day afterward. Richard slowly stood again. His voice was quieter than before. I cannot return the years I stole from you. No. I cannot undo my choices. No. But I would like one chance. He swallowed hard. To make one thing right. Ethan looked at him calmly. What is it? Richard glanced toward Victoria. Then toward Lily. Finally back at Ethan. There is something your daughter deserves to know. Victoria's expression suddenly changed. Father, no more secrets. He looked Ethan straight in the eyes. The reason Victoria searched for you was never only gratitude. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Richard answered with words that stunned even his own daughter. Because after the accident, she made a decision that has shaped every single day of her life. Victoria immediately stood. Please. But Richard continued anyway. She refused to marry. She refused every engagement. She refused every family alliance worth billions of dollars. He pointed toward Ethan. Because she believed she already owed her future to one man. The entire restaurant gasped. Ethan could barely breathe. Victoria closed her eyes, tears silently rolling down her face. But before anyone could say another word, Martha hurried toward the table holding a tablet. Her hands were shaking. "Ms. Sinclair, you need to see this." Victoria looked at the screen. A security recording from earlier that evening had just been uploaded online. The video showed the restaurant manager humiliating Ethan and Lily. The view count was climbing by the second. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. Someone had already shared it across the country. And within minutes, the reputation of Sinclair hospitality was beginning to collapse. The number beside the video climbed so fast that nobody inside the restaurant could believe it. 20,000 views. 50,000. 100,000. Every few seconds another notification appeared. Customers around the dining room reached for their own phones. Some had already seen the clip. Others were watching it for the first time. The video showed Ethan quietly protecting Lily while the restaurant manager publicly humiliated them. It also showed Martha stepping forward to defend a stranger when nobody else would. But the final 10 seconds changed everything. Victoria Sinclair herself walked into the frame. The billionaire owner had chosen the single father over her own management team. Within minutes, millions of Americans were arguing about the story online. Some praised Ethan's dignity. Others applauded Martha's courage. Many demanded answers from Sinclair Hospitality. The restaurant manager watched his own career collapse in real time. His face turned pale. This is a misunderstanding. Victoria slowly looked at him. No, it is exactly what happened. The manager desperately tried to defend himself. I was only protecting the restaurant's reputation. Victoria answered without raising her voice. And you destroyed it. He swallowed hard. I did not know who he was. Victoria's expression became firm. That is precisely the problem. She stepped closer. You believed respect had to be earned by wealth. You never considered that every guest deserved it before you knew their story. The manager lowered his head. Victoria turned toward the head of human resources, who had just arrived after seeing the viral video. I want every employee present to hear this. The room became silent once more. No one is losing a job tonight because of one mistake. Several employees looked relieved. Victoria continued. But anyone who repeatedly humiliates another human being because of appearance, clothing, race, income, or status has no place in my company. She looked directly at the manager. You are relieved of your position. There was no applause, only silence. The manager slowly removed his name badge and placed it on the table. Before leaving, he stopped in front of Ethan. I judged you. I was wrong. I hope one day you can forgive me. Ethan nodded politely. I already have. The answer surprised everyone. Even the former manager looked stunned. You already have? Ethan smiled gently. Carrying anger is heavier than carrying tools. The man quietly walked away with tears in his eyes. Victoria looked at Ethan with admiration. You always do that. What? You forgive people before they deserve it. Ethan laughed softly. No, I forgive people because I deserve peace. Those simple words spread across the restaurant faster than any speech. Several guests began clapping. One table, then another. Within seconds, the entire dining room stood to applaud. Not because Ethan had once saved a billionaire, but because of the man he had chosen to become afterward. When the applause finally settled, Richard Sinclair slowly walked toward Lily. The little girl instinctively held her father's hand. Richard knelt until they were at eye level. I owe your father more than I can ever repay. Lily answered honestly. My dad says people cannot pay back kindness. Richard smiled faintly. He is wiser than I am. He reached into his jacket one final time. This time he removed a small wooden box. Inside lay the original firefighter medal Ethan had been awarded after the rescue. It had never been delivered. Richard looked ashamed. I kept this hidden for 12 years. It belongs to its rightful owner. Ethan accepted the medal with quiet hands. For several long moments, he simply stared at it. Not because of the medal, because it represented a part of himself he thought had disappeared forever. Victoria then stood beside her father. There is one more thing. Everyone looked at her. My company has more than 60,000 employees. She paused. For years we have invested billions in buildings. She smiled at Ethan. It is time we invested more in people. She announced the creation of the Brooks Foundation, a national program that would provide emergency financial assistance for widowed parents, single fathers, single mothers, volunteer firefighters, and children who had lost a parent. Every location owned by Sinclair Hospitality would contribute part of its annual profits. The room erupted into applause again. Reporters who had gathered outside rushed toward the entrance. Television cameras filled the sidewalk. Yet Ethan quietly leaned toward Victoria. "You do not need to name it after me." She smiled. "It was never about honoring your name. It is about reminding people what one ordinary act of kindness can become." Richard slowly stepped beside them. "For the first time in my life, I agree with my daughter." Everyone laughed. Even Richard, perhaps for the first time in many years. Later that evening, after the reporters had left and the restaurant finally became quiet again, Martha approached Lily with a small wrapped package. "It is not expensive. It is simply from a grandmother who never had grandchildren." Inside was a handwritten recipe book. Every dessert Martha had learned to make during 40 years in the restaurant. Lily hugged her tightly. "I will keep it forever. You had better. One day you will make them for someone you love." Outside the restaurant, Ethan and Lily prepared to leave. Their old pickup truck waited exactly where it had always waited. Victoria walked with them to the parking lot. She looked at the weathered truck. "You could drive any car tomorrow." Ethan smiled. "This one still gets us home." She laughed. "I expected that answer." She handed him a business card. "There is no job offer. There is no check. There are no conditions. Only my personal phone number. If you or Lily ever need a friend, call." Ethan accepted the card. "Thank you." Lily suddenly looked up at Victoria. "Can we still come back here next year for my birthday?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears again. "I would be disappointed if you did not." 1 year later, the same window table remained permanently reserved every July. Not for celebrities, not for politicians, not for billionaires. A small bronze plaque rested on its edge. It contained only one sentence: "Everyone who sits here deserves to be seen before they are judged." Guests often asked why that table was never available. The staff would simply smile and tell them there was a story behind it. Some stories begin with wealth. Some begin with tragedy. But the ones people remember forever begin with a simple act of kindness. Because that night, a tired single father believed a billionaire woman had mistaken his table. The truth was far greater. She had been searching for the man who reminded her that the most valuable people in the world rarely look important at first glance. And in the end, neither billions of dollars nor public apologies became the heart of the story. It was a little girl blowing out a birthday candle beside her father, surrounded not by strangers anymore, but by people who had finally learned the difference between seeing someone's clothes and seeing someone's worth.